Picture this: 5 o'clock in the afternoon, a smoking ruin in the middle of the Mexican desert. 5 men stand in the dust, their uniforms shredded, their rifles completely empty. They fix bayonets. Outside, nearly 2,000 enemy soldiers wait for the inevitable surrender. Instead, the 5 men charge. This wasn't the end of a battle, it was the birth of the French Foreign Legion's immortal soul. To truly understand the sacrifice at Cameroon, we must first pull back from the dust of that single hacienda and gaze upon the map of the world as it stood in 1861. It was a moment of profound disruption. The United States, that rising Protestant republic, was tearing itself apart in a brutal civil war, its grand proclamations of liberty dissolving into the smoke of Bull Run. And the old powers of Europe, particularly France, saw not a tragedy, but a vacuum, an opportunity. Across the Atlantic, the nation of Mexico was in chaos. It had just survived its own ruinous civil conflict, the Reform War. The victor, President Benito Juárez, was a liberal, a reformer, and a man of indigenous Zapotec origin. He was also desperate. His nation was shattered and, most critically, bankrupt. In July of 1861, Juárez made a fateful decision. He declared a 2-year moratorium on all foreign debt payments. This act of national survival was seen by Europe as an act of theft. 3 nations, Great Britain, Spain, and France, immediately formed a coalition. Their stated mission, outlined in the Convention of London, was clear. They would jointly invade Mexico, seize the customs houses at the port of Veracruz, and collect their unpaid debts by force. It was, on the surface, a standard, if muscular, act of 19th-century gunboat diplomacy. In December 1861, a combined fleet of British, Spanish, and French warships descended upon Veracruz. The Mexican government, powerless to resist this armada, watched as foreign troops occupied their most important port. The British and Spanish commanders, however, quickly grew uneasy. They had come to collect money, but the French contingent seemed to be operating from a different script. It became clear that the French representative, Dubois de Saligny, was actively working to sabotage any peaceful settlement. The British and Spanish realized they were being used as cover for a much larger, much more ambitious, and much more dangerous French plan. By April 1862, having secured a nominal agreement from the Mexicans, the British and Spanish fleets weighed anchor and sailed for home. They wanted no part in what was coming. But the French stayed. They were not merely debt collectors, they were conquerors. The man pulling the strings from Paris was Emperor Napoleon III, nephew of the great Bonaparte. He was a dreamer, a man obsessed with restoring the glory of the French name and establishing his own legacy. He looked at the paralyzed United States and saw his grand design. He envisioned a new Latin Catholic empire in Central America, a magnificent buffer state that would halt the seemingly unstoppable expansion of the Protestant United States and project French power directly into the New World. He would create a client state, rich in resources, loyal to Paris, and a beacon of French culture. He just needed a monarch, a puppet with a prestigious name. He found his man in Ferdinand Maximilian, the younger brother of the Austrian emperor. Maximilian was ambitious, romantic, and tragically naive. When Napoleon III offered him the restored imperial crown of Mexico, he accepted. The French army, arguably the finest in the world, fresh from victories against Russia in the Crimea and Austria in Italy, would be his sword and his shield. It was a grand, theatrical, and utterly delusional plan. There was only one problem: the Mexican people. Benito Juárez and his Republican forces, the Juaristas, had no intention of accepting a foreign emperor imposed upon them by French bayonets. They had just fought a civil war for their constitution. They would not surrender their country now. When the French army began its march inland from Veracruz, they expected a parade. Instead, on May 5, 1862, at the city of Puebla, they were met by a smaller, poorly equipped Mexican army under General Ignacio Zaragoza. The French attacked with arrogance. The Mexicans defended with desperate courage. The result was a catastrophe for the French. They were repulsed, humiliated, and forced to retreat. The Battle of Puebla, still celebrated as Cinco de Mayo, was a stunning victory for Mexico and a profound embarrassment for Napoleon III. It proved this would not be an easy war. Enraged, Napoleon tripled his commitment. He sent over 30,000 veteran troops to Mexico under a new commander, General Élie Fauré. This time, there would be no mistakes. By 1863, this new army was laying siege to Puebla once more. The war had become a brutal grind. The French held the major cities, but the countryside, the vast expanse of jungle, desert and mountains, belonged to the guerrilleros. This brings us to the central strategic problem of the entire French campaign, the supply line. The French army in the interior was kept alive by a single, vital artery, a 70-mile or 110-kilometre road that snaked its way from the coastal humidity of Veracruz, where every soldier, every bullet, every barrel of wine arrived from France, up through the fever-ridden lowlands and into the high plateau to the besieged army at Puebla. This road was not a road. It was a death trap. It was a gauntlet. The Juaristas, particularly the Republican forces operating under the command of Colonel Francisco de Paula Milán, knew this road intimately. They treated it as their personal hunting ground. They were not disorganized bandits. These were disciplined units of Mexican regular cavalry and infantry, supported by local partisans. They moved through the jungle like ghosts. They struck without warning. Small French patrols were ambushed and annihilated. Supply wagons were captured and burned. Messengers were intercepted, their dispatches taken, their bodies left as a warning. The French army was slowly bleeding to death, not in great set-piece battles, but in 1,000 small cuts along this 70-mile stretch of dirt. By April of 1863, the situation had reached a crisis point. A massive and desperately needed convoy was being assembled at Veracruz. It carried the heavy siege artillery required to finally break the defences of Puebla. It carried tons of ammunition. And, according to intelligence, it carried a payroll of over 3 million francs in gold and silver, money to pay the entire army. Losing this convoy was not an option. It would cripple the siege, demoralize the army, and perhaps even force a French withdrawal. The Mexican High Command knew this, and Colonel Milán was ordered to intercept and destroy it at all costs. General Fauré, the French commander, understood the stakes. The road had to be secured. Every mile of it had to be patrolled. The regular French line infantry, the Troupe de Ligne, and his elite Chasseurs d'Afrique were already stretched thin, garrisoning towns and fighting larger battles. This dirty, thankless, high-risk patrol work in the fever-ridden lowlands was considered beneath them. It was a job for men who were considered expendable. It was the perfect job for the Foreign Legion. Today, the French Foreign Legion is a global icon, a cinematic legend. We picture elite soldiers, men of mystery, marching under the desert sun, seeking adventure or redemption under the iconic white kepi. They are seen as the sharpest tip of the French spear, a romanticized force shrouded in mystique. In 1863, This reputation did not exist. The Legion was not elite. It was not romantic. It was a blunt, brutal instrument of colonial policy, a dumping ground for the human surplus of Europe, designed specifically to fight and die in the swamps, deserts, and jungles that France wished to conquer. Its primary purpose was to save the lives of real French soldiers for real wars in Europe. It was, by its very design, utterly expendable. To understand the men who would soon find themselves trapped in a dusty hacienda, you must first understand the institution that created them. The Legion was founded in 1831 by King Louis Philippe, not out of any grand military vision, but out of a pressing social necessity. The July Revolution of 1830 had flooded Paris with foreign refugees, unemployed veterans, and political agitators from all over Europe. These men were dangerous, restless, and unemployed. Simultaneously, France needed troops for its new, bloody conquest in Algeria, a campaign that was proving deeply unpopular as French conscripts died in horrifying numbers from disease and ambuscade. The Legion was the solution to both problems. Its charter was brutally honest. It was a military unit for foreigners only, and it was specifically barred by law from fighting on the mainland soil of France. It was the army France used to absorb the continent's drift and send it far away to bleed in the sand. Who joined this force? They were not, for the most part, romantic adventurers seeking glory. They were the desperate, the dispossessed, the disgraced. They were Prussian farmers fleeing conscription under the rigid Junkers. They were Italian revolutionaries whose dreams of a unified Italy had been crushed by Austrian cannons. They were Spanish Carlists who had backed the wrong king and could never return home. They were Belgian factory workers who had lost their jobs, Polish nationalists whose homeland had been erased from the map, and Swiss guards left unemployed by the shifting politics of the Vatican. A very significant number, perhaps the majority at this time, were Germans, men from the patchwork of states that had not yet unified, seeking structure and pay. They were the veterans of a dozen forgotten European conflicts, men hardened by defeat, cynical, and often brutalized by their past lives. They were tough, but they were also seen by the regular French army, the troupes de ligne, with open contempt. The legionnaires were les affreux, the frightful ones, the ugly ones. They were seen as mercenaries at best, criminals at worst, a necessary evil to be kept at arm's length. The regular French officer corps, drawn from the aristocracy or the Saint-Cyr military academy, looked down on the Legion's officers as rough-hewn taskmasters rather than gentlemen commanders. This institutional snobbery had practical consequences. The Legion was consistently given the worst assignments. They were stationed in the most remote, disease-ridden garrisons in Algeria, the Bled. They were given the worst barracks, the worst rations, and when war came, the most suicidal missions. They were the men you sent into the fever swamps first. They were the ones ordered to hold the hopeless rear guard. They were, in short, cannon fodder. The Legion's command structure understood this raw, volatile material perfectly. They knew these men were not motivated by gloire or patriotic love for France, so they motivated them with something else. Fear. The discipline within the Legion was legendary, even by the harsh, unforgiving standards of the 19th century military. It was a regime of iron, designed to break a man's past identity and forge him into something new, something that obeyed without question. The Code Militaire was enforced without mercy. Minor infractions that might earn a regular French soldier a reprimand or a few days in the guardhouse could earn a legionnaire a trip to the Peloton de Discipline in North Africa. This was not merely prison, It was a sentence of hard labour in the most hellish conditions imaginable, often a de facto death sentence from disease and overwork. It was a fate considered far worse than a quick death in battle. Yet this very isolation, this institutionalised contempt from the outside world, forged something new and powerful on the inside. When a man joined the Legion, his past was, in theory, erased. His nationality, his potential crimes, his failures, all were supposed to be gone. He was given a new name, a new uniform, and a new family. This new family was the Legion itself. Their motto, adopted through custom and hardship, was not pour la France. It was Legio Patria Nostra. The Legion is our fatherland. This wasn't just a clever slogan. It was a profound psychological replacement. These men had no country that would claim them. Many had no honour left in the outside world. The Legion became the only source of their identity, the only tribe that offered them a place, the only institution that gave them a clear code. This bred an intense, almost fanatical loyalty. It was not a loyalty to France, which they barely knew, nor to the Emperor, whom they had never seen. It was a loyalty to the regiment, to the company, and above all, to the man standing next to them in the ranks. They fought for their comrades. They died for their comrades. Because they had absolutely nothing else. This was the weapon forged in the deserts of Algeria that was now being deployed in the jungles of Mexico. The 1st Foreign Regiment, veterans of these brutal North African campaigns, were sent to the Tierras Calientes, the hot lands of the Veracruz coast. The regular army, composed of French conscripts, preferred the cooler, healthier highlands around Puebla and Mexico City. The Legion was given the swamps. They were given the jungle. They were given the vomito negro, the yellow fever. It was their job to guard the supply line. It was their job to patrol the roads. It was their job to die, far from home, unlamented by the nation they served. On April 29, 1863, the 3rd Company of the 1st Foreign Regiment, a typical mix of Germans, Poles, Italians and Belgians, received what seemed like just another routine, miserable and deeply dangerous patrol. The man who stepped forward to lead this patrol was not a man defined by the front lines. He was, by title, the regimental quartermaster, the capitaine adjudant major. His name was Jean d'Anjou. In the rigid hierarchy of the French army, this was a staff position, a desk job. A quartermaster's war was fought with ink and ledgers, counting boots, weighing flour, arguing with muleteers, and ensuring the ammunition wagons arrived at the right place. It was the vital, thankless administrative spine of the army, but it was not the glory of the charge. D'Anjou was 34 years old, an age when many officers were settling into the predictable comforts of staff work, content to let younger, hotter-blooded men lead the patrols. He wasn't even supposed to be on the roster for this mission. The 3rd Company's designated commander, a Captain Cazes, was ill, confined to his cot by the debilitating local fever. The company needed a leader, and d'Anjou, incapable of remaining behind a desk while his regiment was in the field, volunteered to take his place. This decision, seemingly minor, a simple act of covering a sick comrade's duty, would reroute the destiny of the entire Foreign Legion. This was not a rash impulse. D'Anjou was the absolute embodiment of the professional soldier, a man forged by a lifetime of service in the Legion's harshest proving grounds. Born in 1828, the son of a small-town craftsman, he had entered the Saint-Cyr Military Academy, France's West Point, through sheer merit. He chose the Legion, graduating and shipping out to Algeria, where he immediately proved his mettle. He saw action in Crimea, fighting against the Russians at the brutal siege of Sevastopol. He fought in Italy, part of the campaign that helped forge the modern Italian state. He was a veteran's veteran, quiet, professional, and utterly dedicated. He was also marked by his service. Years earlier, during a mapping expedition in the deserts of Algeria, his musket had malfunctioned and exploded in his hands. The blast destroyed his left hand, forcing its amputation. In its place, he now wore a wooden prosthesis, a simple, functional device that he reportedly designed and helped carve himself. This hand became part of his persona. In staff meetings, he would tap it on the table for emphasis, a sharp, clacking sound of wood on wood that instantly silenced arguments. It was a constant, visible reminder of his sacrifice and his unyielding nature. This was the man, the one-handed quartermaster, who would lead the patrol. His orders, received on the evening of April the 29th, 1863, were precise and deceptively simple. The massive convoy, designated Convoy Z, was preparing to leave Veracruz. It was the army's lifeline. It carried the heavy siege cannons, the big guns, needed to finally breach the walls of Puebla. It carried tons of black powder and millions of rounds of ammunition. And, critically, it carried the army's payroll, 3 million francs in gold coin. This gold was not just for salaries. It was the grease that kept the entire campaign moving, paying local guides, buying food, and securing alliances. Its capture would be a political and military disaster, potentially more damaging than losing the guns. Colonel Milan's Juaristas were known to be operating in the area with significant force, numbering in the thousands. The Legion's mission was to act as an advance screen. Captain d'Anjou would take the 3rd Company, 62 legionnaires and 2 junior officers, 2nd Lieutenants Villain and Morda. He was to march from the Legion's camp at Chiquihuit to the staging post at Palo Verde, a distance of some 15 miles, or 22 kilometres. He was to scout the road, clear any small bands of guerrilleros, and secure the area, ensuring the convoy could pass unmolested the following day. It was a standard reconnaissance in force, a routine, if dangerous, part of their duty in the Tierras Calientes. The force was small, just 65 men in total, but they were deemed sufficient for a scouting mission. They were not expected to fight a pitched battle against Milan's entire army. They were expected to find them and report. Their equipment reflected this limited objective. They were marching light. They left their sacks à dos, their heavy regimental packs, back in camp. These packs contained their greatcoats, their spare uniforms, their full rations, and their personal belongings. Instead, they marched with only what they needed for a 24-hour patrol: their Patton 1857 rifle muskets, their 60-round ammunition pouches, their bayonets, and their bidons, or canteens. They took no pack mules. No mules meant no reserve ammunition. No mules meant no extra water. This last detail, barely an afterthought in the cool of the pre-dawn, would become a fatal, agonizing oversight. The 62 enlisted men who formed the company were the Legion itself in miniature, a hard mosaic of European desperation. Contemporary analysis of the company's roster reveals it was overwhelmingly German and Polish, with a significant number of Belgians, Italians, and Spaniards. These were not fresh-faced recruits. The average age was high. They were veterans, hardened by the endless, brutal counter-insurgency warfare in Algeria, men who knew how to load, fire, and march in their sleep. They were men who had joined the Legion to forget their past and now found their only future in the absolute, unwavering loyalty to the men beside them. They trusted d'Anjou. He was not their usual company commander, but he was a known quantity, a respected staff officer, and a vrai légionnaire. He was one of them. At 1 o'clock in the morning on April 30th, 1863, the company formed up in the darkness. Danjou, his wooden hand resting on the hilt of his sword, gave the quiet command to advance. The 65 men marched out of Chiquihuit, their footsteps muffled by the dust of the road. The air was cool, the march easy. But they were walking into a landscape that was already awake, observed by unseen eyes. Colonel Milan had deployed his forces perfectly, and Danjou's tiny company was marching directly, fatally, into their path. The march had continued for 6 hours. 6 hours of pushing through the pre-dawn chill, the only sound the rhythmic crunch of 65 pairs of boots on the dusty track and the occasional clink of a canteen against a bayonet sheath. The tierras calientes, the hot lands, were beginning to wake. The oppressive humidity, a suffocating wet blanket, was already climbing as the sun broke the horizon, painting the eastern sky in hues of pale yellow and blood orange. Captain Danjou called a halt. The spot was Palo Verde, a collection of ruined shacks and overgrown corrals, notable only for being the designated staging post on their reconnaissance. It was 7 o'clock in the morning. The men were grateful. They broke ranks, stacking their rifles, wiping the sweat and grime from their faces. Water was already becoming a preoccupation. The canteens, filled hours ago in the dark, were already feeling light. They had marched 15 miles and the day had barely begun. Some men sat, resting their backs against the crumbling adobe walls. Others started the small fires for their morning coffee, the one luxury the patrol afforded. The air was still, heavy, too still. A sentry, posted on a slight rise, suddenly stiffened. He did not shout. He hissed. "Capitaine." Danjou was by his side in an instant, his spyglass raised. To the north, perhaps a mile distant, a large cloud of dust was rising against the morning light. It was not a wind devil. The dust was organized, moving fast, and beneath it, the unmistakable glint of steel. Cavalry. Danjou's reaction was immediate, instinctive, and drawn straight from the textbook. "Form square." The command cut through the quiet morning. Coffee was kicked over, rifles snatched up. In less than a minute, the 65 men had formed a tight 3-rank square, bayonets fixed, facing outward. A bristling hedgehog of steel, the classic defence against a cavalry charge. The men stood waiting, their knuckles white on their rifle stocks, their eyes scanning the approaching horsemen. The dust cloud resolved itself into hundreds of riders, lanceros in their wide sombreros, their colourful serapes flapping, their long lances held high. It was a formidable sight, enough to break the nerve of untested troops. But the legionnaires held. They were veterans. They had faced cavalry in Algeria. They waited for the charge. But the charge never came. The Mexican cavalry, numbering perhaps 800 to 1,000 men, flowed around them. They galloped past just outside of effective musket range, whooping and firing their carbines into the air. It was a demonstration, a taunt. They made no attempt to close with the square. Danjou, his wooden hand resting on his pistol, watched them with a growing sense of unease. This was wrong. Cavalry, if it meant to attack, attacked. It did not perform a parade. This was not an assault. It was a screen. It was bait. He turned his spyglass not toward the cavalry in front of him, but to his rear, back down the road they had just marched. And his blood ran cold. The road to Chiquihuit, their only path of retreat, was gone. It was no longer a road. It was a moving river of men. Emerging from the dense chaparral on both sides of the route, where they had been waiting in perfect silence, was the main body of the Mexican army. This was not a band of guerrilleros. This was not a rogue patrol. This was an army. He saw ranks of infantry, thousands of them, battalion after battalion, forming disciplined lines that stretched across the valley. They were deploying methodically, their officers on horseback, their regimental flags unfurling in the breeze. They were not moving to attack the square directly. They were moving to secure the road, to cut the legionnaires off, to seal the trap. The man commanding this force was Colonel Francisco de Paula Milan, a competent and ruthless officer of the Republican Army. He knew exactly what he was doing. He had intelligence that the French convoy was coming, and he knew this Legion patrol was its advance guard. His orders were simple: annihilate this patrol, then find and destroy the convoy. And he had brought the tools to do it. His officers estimated his total force at well over 2,500 men, perhaps as many as 3,000. Against Danjou's 65, the odds were not 10 to 1, they were not 20 to 1, they were more than 40 to 1. The Mexican cavalry in front of them now ceased its demonstration and began to slowly tighten the circle, penning the square in place. The infantry to their rear continued to deploy, a solid wall of steel blocking any hope of escape. The legionnaires were surrounded in the open on flat ground, with no cover, no water, and no hope of reinforcement. The convoy was miles away, oblivious. The regiment was miles away, oblivious. They were utterly, completely alone. For a long moment, Danjou stood motionless, assessing the geometry of the trap. He could stay here, in the open, and be annihilated in minutes by a combined cavalry and infantry assault. Or he could move. He had to find ground he could defend. A place where 40 to 1 might mean something other than immediate death. His eyes scanned the horizon, past the wheeling cavalry, past the burning embers of their morning coffee. And he saw it. About half a mile away, a collection of low, mud-brick walls, the sun-baked ruins of a ranch, the Hacienda Camerone. It was not a fortress, it was barely a building, but it was their only chance. "Form column," Danjou ordered, his voice steady, betraying no trace of the desperation he must have felt. "We make for the Hacienda, au pas de charge." They would have to run. They would have to run through 800 lances to get to a pile of mud. The battle for survival had begun. They reached it in a desperate, ragged sprint. It was not a controlled retreat. It was a half-mile race against 800 mounted lancers. The legionnaires, already breathing heavily from their morning march, their heavy wool uniforms acting like personal saunas, pushed their bodies to the limit. They ran in a loose column, officers shouting to maintain cohesion, sergeants grabbing men who stumbled. The Mexican cavalry, initially surprised by the sudden dash, quickly understood. They fanned out, their horses easily closing the distance, whooping and firing their carbines. The air filled with the angry snap of bullets passing over their heads, kicking up dust at their heels. Men gritted their teeth, their lungs on fire, their 60 rounds of ammunition bouncing heavily against their hips, their rifles feeling like anchors. They were just yards from the main gate when the first of the lanceros got close enough to lower their lances. The legionnaires fired a few wild, unaimed shots over their shoulders, a desperate attempt to buy another second. They tumbled through the main archway, the last man literally diving through as the heavy wooden gates were slammed shut, the thud of a heavy bar dropping into its brackets. A few stray lance tips poked through the cracks. A handful of defiant shots from the wall finally drove the horsemen back, forcing them to regroup just outside of rifle range. A momentary pause. A blessing. The 65 survivors of the 3rd Company, gasping for breath, sweat stinging their eyes, leaned against the walls, their chests heaving. They had bought themselves minutes. They finally had a moment to look at the fortress they had just risked everything to reach. It was not a fortress. It was a tomb. The Hacienda de la Trinidad de Camerone was a derelict, abandoned ranch, a sun-baked skeleton of a building left to crumble in the Tierra Caliente. It offered 2 large courtyards, a main ranch house, and a smaller corral, all surrounded by crumbling adobe walls. Those walls, perhaps 10, maybe 12 feet high, were the only defence they had, and they were useless. They were riddled with wide, gaping breaches, some large enough for a cart to pass, where entire sections had collapsed. The fortress was more hole than wall. It was a defensive sieve, not a shield. Captain d'Anjou, his face caked in dust, his wooden hand a stark contrast to the living one gripping his sword, wasted no time on despair. He was a professional. This was the ground he had. He would make it work. He was a quartermaster. He understood logistics and structure. And he was a combat engineer from his time in Algeria. He understood siege warfare. He scanned the tactical geometry of the ruin. The main house, a 2-story structure, would be their keep, their final redoubt. The surrounding walls, however broken, would be their outer perimeter. They would force the enemy to fight for every inch. Barricade the gates, plug those gaps. His voice cut through the chaos. The legionnaires, their bodies already screaming for rest, obeyed instantly. They were veterans. They knew what this meant. They tore at the ruins around them with frantic, disciplined energy. They dragged heavy termite-eaten beams from a collapsed roof. They ripped the heavy plank doors from the ranch house hinges. They overturned a broken farm wagon, its wheels spinning uselessly, to block the largest breach. They grabbed broken tables, chairs, anything with mass. They hacked at the tough, thorny chaparral, mesquite, and prickly pear cacti growing in the courtyard, piling it all into the gaps. Their hands were ripped open by the thorns, but they barely noticed. They were creating a desperate, primitive abattis, an obstacle that would entangle the attackers, slow them down, and hold them in the killing zone. While half the men worked, their muscles straining, the other half took to the walls. They began punching makeshift loopholes, meurtriers, into the soft, crumbling adobe with their bayonets. The scraping sound of steel on dried mud, the puff of acrid dust with every thrust. They were creating firing positions. d'Anjou and his 2 young lieutenants, Villain and Mordet, moved quickly along the perimeter, assigning sectors. 10 men to the north wall, 12 to the south, covering the main gate, a handful to the roof of the small stable block, giving them a high vantage point. They were stretching 65 men to cover a perimeter meant for 300. It was a threadbare line. In some places, a single legionnaire stood every 5 or 6 feet, an isolated defender responsible for his own small section of the apocalypse. As the men settled into their positions, they could see the full extent of the Mexican army deploying. The cavalry, the lanceros and carabineros had formed a perfect, unbreachable circle around the hacienda, and beyond them, the infantry. Thousands of them. Battalion after battalion, their dark blue uniforms and red facings a stark contrast to the dusty landscape. Their regimental flags unfurled, their bayonets fixed. The sheer weight of their numbers was a physical presence, an ocean of men waiting to drown the tiny island of the hacienda. The legionnaires checked their ammunition, 60 rounds per man. It seemed like a lot. It would not be enough. And then, as the legionnaires prepared for the inevitable assault, one of the men, his throat already parched, made the fatal discovery. He searched the main courtyard. He searched the corral. He kicked open the door to the ranch house, his eyes scanning the dusty interior. Nothing. A whisper started, a cold dread that spread faster than any bullet. Capitaine, il n'y a pas d'eau. There was no well. There was no cistern. There was no stream. The only water they possessed was the lukewarm, metallic-tasting dregs at the bottom of their bidons, canteens that were already half empty from the grueling 15-mile morning march. They were trapped in a sun-baked clay oven, about to fight an army, with perhaps half a litre of water per man. The Mexican sun was just beginning its brutal, vertical climb. It was 9 o'clock in the morning. The temperature was already soaring past 35 degrees Celsius, climbing toward 40. 100 degrees Fahrenheit. 110. They were wearing thick wool uniforms. They would be performing extreme physical labour, loading and firing heavy rifles, fighting hand to hand. They would lose litres of sweat. They would be choking on acrid black powder smoke. They would be dead from heat stroke and dehydration by nightfall, even if the Mexicans never fired another shot. The enemy was not just outside the walls. It was inside their bodies. It was in the sky. Danjou looked at his men. They looked at him. They all understood the equation. There would be no rescue. The convoy was too far. The regiment did not even know they were here. There was no escape. This hacienda was not a fortress. It was a pre-dug grave. It was the place they would die. The only question left, the only thing they still controlled, was how. The hacienda fell into a grim, expectant silence. The only sounds were the scrape of bayonets being fixed, the click of rifle hammers being checked, and the muffled, distant sound of an army deploying. Thousands of men, thousands of hooves, a low, vibrating hum that seemed to come from the earth itself. The legionnaires were professionals, but they were also human. They looked at the crumbling walls, at their 60 rounds of ammunition, at the half-litre of water in their canteens. They looked at the Mexican sun, already a white-hot disk climbing the sky. They knew this equation. There was no solution that ended in survival. Captain Jean d'Anjou saw this calculation in their eyes. He saw the grim acceptance, the fatalism. These were men who had been betrayed by life, by nations, by kings. They were here to die. But d'Anjou, in this final moment, decided they would not die as nameless, forgotten expatriates. They would die as legionnaires. He gathered his 64 men in the main courtyard, a small cluster of blue coats in the vast, dusty expanse. He stood before them, not on a crate, not on a platform, but on the same ground as them. He was a man of 34 years, calm, his gaze steady. He was in every way their equal in this moment. He waited until every eye was upon him. Then slowly he unbuttoned the cuff of his right sleeve and raised his left arm, the wooden hand. He held it high, the articulated wooden fingers catching the harsh morning light. It was the symbol of his own sacrifice, the price he had already paid. He began to speak, his voice not loud, but carrying with a cold, absolute clarity in the dead air. He spoke in French, the required language of the Legion, a tongue foreign to most of the Germans, Poles and Italians who stood before him. But they understood every word. He reminded them of their mission, to protect the convoy, to protect the gold, the guns, and the lives of their comrades who depended on it. He told them that to stop this Mexican army here was their duty. And then he made the demand. He asked them to swear, not to fight, not to be brave. He asked them to swear that they would defend the hacienda to the last extremity, that they would not surrender, that they would die rather than yield. He raised his wooden hand higher. Jurez-vous de vous défendre jusqu'à la mort? Do you swear to defend yourselves to the death? One by one, the 64 men raised their right hands. Germans, Poles, Belgians, Spaniards, men who had nothing in common but the green and red epaulets on their shoulders. They looked at their one-handed captain, a man who had volunteered for this, and they swore the oath. Nous le jurons. We swear it. It was a collective suicide pact. It was the moment the battle ceased to be about tactics and became about honour. The ritual was complete. The men returned to the walls. The time for talking was over. The Mexicans, having now fully deployed their infantry and artillery, were surprised by the silence. This tiny garrison, this 60 men. They had not tried to flee. They had not surrendered. This was a violation of military logic. Colonel Milan, a professional soldier, respected bravery. He did not want to needlessly massacre this small band of Europeans. He ordered a white flag. A Mexican officer, perhaps Major Campos, rode forward, his hand raised in truce. A legionnaire on the wall signalled to hold fire. The officer shouted the terms in French. He identified his commander and the scale of their force, pointing to the 2,000 infantry and 1,000 cavalry now visible. The colonel offers you honourable surrender. You will be treated as prisoners of war. He honours your courage. Do not die for nothing. There was a long pause. The legionnaires watched their captain. Danjou walked to the wall, his wooden hand clacking against his sword hilt. He looked down at the emissary. His reply became the most famous sentence in the Legion's history. He shouted back, "Tell your colonel, we have cartridges, and we will not surrender." The emissary stared in disbelief, saluted stiffly, and galloped back to the Mexican lines. The white flag vanished. It was replaced by the red flag of no quarter. Milan had his answer. The attack would begin. It was approximately 10 o'clock in the morning. The bugles of the Mexican cazadores and zapadores battalions sounded the charge. This was not a chaotic mob. This was a disciplined, coordinated assault by thousands of regular infantry, advancing in solid columns, their bayonets glistening. They targeted the weakest points, the main gate, and the largest, most hastily barricaded breaches. They came on with a roar, expecting to sweep over the low walls in a single, human wave. But the men inside were not regular French infantry. They were not trained to stand in parade ground lines and fire volleys. They were legionnaires. They were veterans of the Algerian Guerre de Razzias. They were, by instinct and brutal training, skirmishers and marksmen. Each of the 65 men found his loophole. They did not fire in volleys. They fired as individuals. They picked their targets. This was the deadly arithmetic of the Minié rifle, accurate, powerful, and in the hands of a veteran, a surgeon's scalpel. They did not aim for the mass. They aimed for the officers on horseback. They aimed for the standard bearers. They aimed for the sergeants urging the lines forward. The Mexican advance, so brave and disciplined, was suddenly decapitated. Officers tumbled from their saddles. Banners fell into the dust. The columns began to lose their cohesion, but they did not stop. They reached the walls. They reached the barricades. The battle became a close, suffocating brawl. Mexican soldiers, screaming, tried to tear the thorny cacti and broken wagons from the breaches. Legionnaires thrust their bayonets through the gaps, a wall of steel. Pistols were fired at point-blank range, the muzzle flash scorching the faces of the men on either side. At the main gate, Mexican sappers, brave men carrying axes, ran forward to smash the heavy wooden beams. They were shot down, one after another, piling up at the very threshold of the gate. For perhaps 20 minutes, the chaos raged. But the focused, accurate, methodical fire from the loopholes was simply too much. The attackers were funneled into killing zones, unable to bring their vast numbers to bear. The assault faltered, stopped, and then broke. They fell back. A stunned, bloody wave, leaving hundreds of dead and wounded scattered in the dust just yards from the wall. A ragged cheer went up from the legionnaires. They had done it. They had held, but the cost was already becoming clear. Men frantically checked their ammunition pouches. They were suddenly terrifyingly lighter. The first assault had cost them nearly a third of their precious 60 rounds. And the sun. The sun was higher now. The adobe walls were no longer just cover. They were the sides of a kiln, reflecting the heat, baking the men inside. The thirst, held at bay by the adrenaline of the first fight, returned with a vengeance, a scratching, clawing thing in the back of every man's throat. The Mexicans had been repulsed, but they had learned a valuable lesson. And as the sun climbed toward noon, Captain Danjou, their iron-willed leader, moved from his command post to inspect the damage on the wall. The first great wave had broken. A strange, suffocating silence descended upon the Hacienda Camerone, broken only by the groans of the Mexican wounded outside the walls, and the rasping, desperate breath of the defenders inside. The legionnaires, their hands raw and bleeding from the thorny barricades, their faces masked in the black powder grime of their first volleys, stared out from their new-cut loopholes. They had held. They had met the first test. They had inflicted horrifying, disproportionate casualties on an enemy that outnumbered them by more than 40 to 1. For a fleeting moment, a wild, impossible hope might have flickered in their hearts. Perhaps the Mexicans, seeing the bloody cost of this initial assault, would simply recoil, regroup, and leave. Perhaps the convoy was already safe. Perhaps they had done enough. But that hope died as quickly as it was born. The circle of Mexican cavalry, the lanceros, did not retreat. They simply waited, a patient ring of steel just beyond rifle range. And the infantry, the thousands of soldados who had been repulsed, were not fleeing. They were reforming, their officers calmly dressing their lines, their bugles sounding the rally. They were professionals too. They were preparing for the second assault. This was not a victory. It was an intermission. And now, as the adrenaline of the first clash faded, the true enemy revealed itself. It was not the men outside the walls. It was the sun. It was 11 o'clock in the morning. The battle had raged for perhaps an hour. The Mexican sun, their real executioner, was now climbing toward its zenith. The temperature was already soaring, climbing past 40 degrees Celsius. That is 104, even 105 degrees Fahrenheit. In the open, dusty courtyard, with no shade, no breeze, it was a physical hammer blow. The adobe walls, which offered meagre protection from bullets, now acted as a giant clay oven, absorbing the sun's fury and radiating it back onto the men trapped inside. The air was still, thick with the acrid metallic stench of black powder smoke and the sweet copper smell of blood. And the thirst. The thirst was no longer a distant concern. It was a physical enemy. It was a clawing, scratching, burning presence in every man's throat. Their lips began to crack. Their tongues, caked with powder residue and dust, began to feel thick and swollen in their mouths. They had marched for 6 hours. They had fought a desperate hour-long battle. They had sweated litres of moisture under the strain, their thick wool uniforms plastered to their bodies like a suffocating shroud. And they had perhaps 1 or 2 mouthfuls of lukewarm, metallic-tasting water left in their bidons. Some men, in quiet desperation, began to scour the ruined ranch house. They found nothing. No well, no cistern, no forgotten barrel. They found a few bottles of aguardiente, perhaps some local rum, left behind by the departed owners. They drank it, but the alcohol, as they well knew, was a cruel, temporary relief. It was a chemical betrayal that would only accelerate their dehydration, borrowing vitality from a future they did not have. Other men, according to the darkest parts of the legend, resorted to the last desperate measure of besieged soldiers, a final horrifying humiliation. They urinated into their cupped hands or into their canteens, let the liquid cool, and drank it, trying to reclaim any moisture their bodies had lost. This was the reality of their situation. This was the price of their oath. They were not just fighting an army, they were fighting the sun itself. And it was in this brief, agonizing lull, as the men reckoned with their new internal enemy, that the battle's first hero fell. Captain Jean d'Anjou, the man of iron, the quartermaster who had volunteered for this, was doing what a commander does. He was inspecting his perimeter. He was moving from post to post, checking the barricades, redistributing ammunition. He was speaking to his men, his voice calm, his wooden hand a steady, tangible presence. He was not hiding. He was leading. He stepped out from the relative cover of the main house into the sun-blasted courtyard, perhaps moving to reinforce the south wall where the first assault had been heaviest. He was visible. He was an officer. He was a target. From the roof of a nearby building hundreds of yards away, a Mexican marksman, one of the zapadores, or perhaps a cazador, saw the glint of an officer's insignia. He steadied his rifle. He took aim. He fired. There was no thunderclap, just a single, sharp crack that was almost lost in the din of the preparing army. D'Anjou stopped. He looked down at his chest. A dark, rapidly spreading stain was blooming across the blue wool of his tunic, just above his heart. He did not cry out. He did not stagger. He simply collapsed, folding into the dust he had sworn to defend. He was dead almost instantly. The bullet had struck him full in the chest, a mortal wound. Several legionnaires, seeing him fall, rushed to his side. They lifted him, carrying his body into the shade of the ranch house. It was useless. The man who had been the company's unshakable centre, the man who had extracted their sacred oath with his own wooden hand, held high just an hour before, was gone. The soul of the defence had been ripped out. For a moment, the battle stopped. The legionnaires looked at the body of their fallen captain, and then at each other. This was the crisis point. This was when an ordinary unit would break. They were leaderless, hopeless, dying of thirst, and surrounded by an ocean of enemies. But they were not an ordinary unit. They were the Legion, and they had sworn an oath. From the smoke and confusion, Second Lieutenant Jean Villain stepped forward. He was young, just 28 years old, but he was a Legion officer. The chain of command was absolute. He knelt for a moment by d'Anjou's body, perhaps said a brief prayer, perhaps just registered the profound, terrible loss. Then he stood up. "The captain is dead," his voice rang out, steady, cutting through the despair. "I am in command. Back to the walls. Vive la Légion." The men, their faces grim, their hearts hardened by grief, returned to their loopholes. Their resolve was now something colder and darker than mere duty. The battle was no longer about the convoy. The convoy was an abstraction, a forgotten detail from another lifetime. This battle was no longer about strategy, or Mexico, or even France. It was about the oath. It was about the man who lay dead in the ranch house. It was about the honour of the Third Company. They would hold this ground, or they would join their captain in its dust. The Mexicans outside, perhaps sensing the lull, perhaps seeing the brief confusion, began to move. Their bugles sounded again, the sharp, brassy notes cutting through the heat. The second assault was coming. Lieutenant Villain, now in command of a dying company, checked his pistol and prepared to meet it. The lull was a mirage, a cruel trick of the heat. The silence that descended upon the hacienda was not the sound of an enemy retreating, but of an enemy learning, adapting, and repositioning. Around 1 o'clock in the afternoon, after nearly 2 hours of this agonizing sun-baked quiet, the Mexican bugles sang their sharp, brassy song once more. The second grand assault began. This time, the Juaristas were smarter. Colonel Milan had learned from the bloody repulse of his first attack. His men advanced not in the dense, brave columns that had been so devastatingly targeted, but in looser, more fluid skirmish lines. They used the scrub, the undulations of the ground, and the bodies of their own fallen comrades for cover. They moved from point to point, firing methodically at the Legion's loopholes, a crawling, creeping tide of gunfire designed to suppress the defenders' deadly, accurate volleys. For the Legionnaires inside, the fight had changed. The heat was now a physical weight, a suffocating presence that seemed to slow their movements, to fog their minds. The thirst was no longer an inconvenience, it was a razor blade in their throats. Their fire discipline, so perfect in the morning, became ragged, not from fear, but from a desperate, terrifying calculation. Every shot was now weighed. Is he a target? Is he close enough? Will this shot count? Every paper cartridge torn open with their teeth, the black powder gritty and foul on their swollen tongues, was one less cartridge between them and the inevitable bayonet. They repulsed the attack. Again. They held the walls. But the cost was catastrophic. Ammunition pouches were nearly empty. The ground inside the hacienda was littered with their own dead and wounded, their blue coats dark with blood. The Mexicans fell back, leaving another ring of bodies. But Colonel Milan was a patient, calculating commander. He had seen the stubbornness of the defence. He knew he was trading hundreds of his men for dozens of theirs, but he had hundreds, even thousands, to spare. And he had time. He decided, in a moment of cold tactical brilliance, that he no longer needed to storm the walls. He would burn them out. The Mexican tactic shifted. Skirmishers, covered by heavy suppressing fire, crept close to the outer buildings. They carried torches, bundles of dry brush, and wood dipped in oil. They tossed them onto the dry thatched roofs of the ranch house and the stables. The wood, baked by the Mexican sun for decades, caught almost instantly. A crackle, a wisp of smoke, and then a sudden, terrifying whoosh as the entire roof of the main house exploded in flame. The Legionnaires' fortress became their funeral pyre. Fire swept through the hacienda. Thick, acrid, choking smoke poured into the courtyard, blinding the defenders, stinging their eyes, filling their already parched and heaving lungs. The heat from the flames was now more intense, more immediate than the sun. It was a physical, searing pain. The men were forced to abandon the main firing positions along the walls. Their carefully constructed barricades, their painstakingly carved loopholes, were now useless, engulfed in a wall of fire. Lieutenant Villain, his face blackened by soot, his uniform singed, saw the tactical situation collapse. They could not hold the perimeter. They would be roasted alive. "To the stables!" he roared, his voice cracking. "O Santa!" He ordered the retreat, abandoning the outer walls. The surviving legionnaires, perhaps 30, maybe 35 of them, stumbled through the blinding, suffocating smoke, dragging their wounded comrades, falling back to the small central corral. This was a tiny open space, perhaps 50 feet square, surrounded by a low stone wall that offered almost no cover. This was their Alamo moment. This was their last redoubt. This was the moment the Mexicans had been waiting for. The third assault. As the legionnaires fell back in confusion, their formation broken by the fire and smoke, Mexican infantry poured through the now undefended breaches, swarming into the main courtyard. The battle devolved into a chaotic, close-quarters melee. It was no longer a siege. It was a brawl. It was butchery. In this inferno of smoke, flame, and point-blank gunfire, Lieutenant Villain, was seen rallying his men for a final stand. He was the last link to Danjou, the last officer holding the line. A volley of Mexican musketry, fired from less than 20 yards away, cut him down. He fell, dead before he hit the ground. The second officer was gone. Command, by default, fell to the last officer standing, Sous-Lieutenant Clément Maudet. He was just 23 years old, a young officer of the line, but now the fate, the honour, and the oath of the Third Company rested entirely on his shoulders. He gathered the survivors, perhaps 20 men, in the last defensible corner of the stable yard. They formed a tiny, pathetic circle, back to back, fighting with bayonets and rifle butts, as Mexican soldados surged around them. For another 2 hours, from 2 o'clock until well past 4, the battle became a slow, agonizing grind. It was no longer a fight. It was an execution. The Mexicans, now holding the main house and the outer walls, had all the cover. They stopped the costly, chaotic frontal charges and simply began to pick the legionnaires off, one by one. Methodical, patient, sharpshooting. The legionnaires, trapped in the open, sun-blasted courtyard, had nowhere to hide. They crouched behind the bodies of their own dead comrades. They crouched behind a few dead mules that had been caught in the crossfire. They crouched behind a shallow stone water trough that had long since turned to mud, its promise of water a final, bitter irony. The sun beat down, the fires roared, the smoke choked them, and the bullets found them. A man checking his rifle would slump forward, a neat, dark hole in his forehead. Another, trying to return fire, would cry out and collapse, his leg shattered. The courtyard became a butcher's yard. By 4 o'clock in the afternoon, 9 hours after the first shot, the firing tapered off. The Mexicans, perhaps shocked by the resilience of the men they were killing, paused. Lieutenant Maudet, himself wounded, his face a mask of dried blood and black powder, looked around him. Of the 20 men who had made the last stand in the courtyard, perhaps 12 were still alive. All were wounded. All were out of water. Their pouches were empty. They had, by most accounts, perhaps 1 or 2 cartridges left per man. They had become what their oath demanded, the living dead. It was 5 o'clock in the afternoon. The battle, which had raged in a suffocating 10-hour crescendo of gunpowder and screaming, had finally fallen into a strange, heavy silence. The constant, methodical crack of Mexican rifles from the perimeter had slowed, then sputtered, then stopped. Colonel Milan, his soldiers now holding the smouldering ruins of the main house and the entire outer perimeter, was waiting. He was a professional soldier, and he knew this fight was over. It was simply a matter of time, of letting the sun and the thirst finish the job his bullets had started. Inside the small, scorched corral, the air was almost unbreathable. It was a thick, noxious soup of acrid smoke from the still smouldering stable roof, the fine, pulverized dust of the adobe walls, and the overwhelming, sweet, sickening stench of death. The low stone wall, perhaps 3 feet high, offered almost no protection. It was a grave marker, not a fortification. Behind this last pathetic barricade, Sous-Lieutenant Clément Maudet, the 23-year-old officer upon whom the entire honour of the Third Company now rested, took a painful, final inventory. He was wounded, a piece of shrapnel or a spent ball had torn his arm. The blood dried into a black crust on his sleeve. He looked at the men who remained, his army. There was Corporal Maine, a veteran whose face was an unrecognizable mask of powder grime and dried blood. There was Legionnaire Wenzel, a German, breathing in shallow, ragged gasps, but still holding his rifle. Legionnaire Cateau, a Belgian, was trying to wipe the stinging sweat and smoke from his eyes. And Legionnaire Constantin, another Belgian, who was slumped against the wall but pushed himself upright when his lieutenant's eyes fell on him. 5 men left from the 65 who had marched out of Chiquihuite in the cool darkness of the morning a lifetime ago. The others were a silent, broken testament to the price of the oath, piled in the dust or slumped against the burning stable walls, their blue coats indistinguishable from the shadows. Mordet checked his revolver, the officer's sidearm. He had opened it 10 minutes ago. Every chamber was empty. He looked at his 4 remaining comrades. They held their rifles, but the weapons were now useless, just heavy, fire-blackened pieces of wood and steel. Their ammunition pouches, the giberns, were flat, empty. They had been empty for some time. The legend, born in this very moment, would later claim they saved 1 final bullet each, perhaps for the enemy commander, perhaps for themselves in the ultimate defiance. The truth is likely simpler and more grim. They were just empty. They had fired their last shots, their 60th round, their 59th, into the last desperate charge, and now there was nothing. They had nothing left to fight with. Nothing except 12 inches of triangular steel, the Rosalie bayonet, still fixed to the end of their useless rifles. Through the shimmering heat haze, a new figure appeared, a Mexican officer holding his sabre high with a scrap of white cloth tied to the hilt, a flag of truce. He advanced cautiously, his boots kicking up small puffs of dust, walking alone into the centre of the devastated courtyard. He stopped, perhaps 50 feet away, close enough to see the 5 survivors, to see their condition. He looked, by all accounts, not triumphant, but astonished, weary. He shouted in French, his voice carrying clearly in the dead air, "Rindanse, surrender." He spoke with the formal courtesy of a professional soldier addressing another. "The Colonel, General Milan, recognizes your unbelievable bravery. He offers you honourable terms. Surrender now, and your lives will be spared. You will be treated as prisoners of war. Your honour is intact. You have done more. Mon Dieu, you have done more than any men could ask. The offer hung in the air. Honourable surrender, medical care, water, life. It was a lifeline thrown to 5 men who were, by every rational measure, already dead." Wenzel looked at Maine. Cateau stared at the ground. They were all looking at Mordet. He was the last officer. He was the guardian of the oath. He could release them. He could let them live. Mordet looked at the Mexican officer. He thought of the 60 men who now lay dead around him. He thought of Lieutenant Villain, killed just hours before. He thought of Captain Danjou, his one-handed leader, the man who had raised that wooden hand and asked them to swear. They had sworn not to fight bravely. They had sworn not to surrender. The oath was absolute. It was not conditional on success or on hope or on reason. It was an iron contract sealed by their captain's blood, and its only acceptable fulfilment was death. Mordet was the last officer. The oath was his to keep. Surrender was not an option. It had been sworn out of existence at 10 o'clock that morning, and no amount of Mexican honour or human thirst could bring it back. He turned to the Mexican officer. His own voice was a dry, rasping croak, the sound of a man who had not drunk water in 10 hours of furnace-like heat. He refused. The Mexican officer stared, perhaps in disbelief, perhaps in anger, perhaps in profound, stunned admiration. This was beyond courage. This was madness. He saluted stiffly, turned his back, and walked away. The white flag was gone. Mordet turned to his 4 remaining comrades. He did not need to give a speech. He did not need to remind them of the oath. Their presence here, still standing, was reminder enough. He simply gave the last order of the 3rd Company, a quiet, hoarse command. Fix bayonets. The click of the 4 bayonets locking into place was the only sound. The 5 men, 2 Frenchmen, a German, a Belgian, and a Pole, stood shoulder to shoulder, a broken, bleeding, utterly defeated line. They were surrounded by an army. They were out of water. They were out of ammunition. They were out of time. They were out of everything. Everything except their honour. Morday, a 23-year-old lieutenant given an impossible choice, raised his officer's sabre, the polished steel glinting a dull, bloody red in the low evening sun. Vive la Légion! The cry was weak, cracked, barely human, but it was the cry of absolute, total, sublime defiance. And the 5 men charged. They charged out from behind their low stone wall, 5 exhausted, wounded men, running on the last fumes of adrenaline and suicidal pride, their bayonets levelled. They charged directly into the 2,000 Mexican soldiers who surrounded the courtyard. For a single, stunned, eternal second, the Mexican soldiers, veterans themselves, men who had seen war in all its forms, simply stared. They had never, in all their lives, seen anything like this. This was not warfare. This was not tactics. This was something else. This was madness. This was magnificent. The moment passed. The Mexican officers, their own honour demanding they respond to this final, desperate insult, gave the order. Fuego! A single, massive, ragged volley crashed out from hundreds of rifles, a wall of lead fired at point-blank range. The 5 men disappeared into the cloud of white smoke. Lieutenant Clément Maudet was hit multiple times, killed instantly, his sabre falling from his hand. Legionnaire Cateau crumpled beside him. Legionnaire Constantin, his charge cut short, spun and fell, mortally wounded. The smoke cleared. The echoes of the volley died, replaced once again by that terrible, heavy, final silence. 2 men were left standing, staggering in the dust, surrounded by hundreds of Mexican bayonets. The charge of the last 5 was over. The Mexican soldiers lowered their smoking rifles. An awestruck silence fell over the courtyard, a silence so profound it seemed louder than the battle itself. 2 legionnaires were still on their feet, staggering, but alive. Corporal Maine and Legionnaire Wenzel. They were wounded, bleeding from multiple bayonet and bullet wounds, swaying from exhaustion and thirst. They stood back to back, their bayonets pointed outward, ready to fight the entire Mexican army with nothing but cold steel. A Mexican officer, identified in some accounts as Colonel Combas, stepped forward, his sword lowered. He did not order his men to fire again. He simply approached the 2 survivors, a look of profound, almost reverent disbelief on his face. "Surrender now," he said, his voice quiet. "You have done enough. Men like you deserve to live." Corporal Maine looked at the officer, then at the thousands of soldiers surrounding him, then at the bodies of his comrades. He finally lowered his rifle. But he surrendered with one last act of Legion defiance. He would surrender, he stated, only if the Mexicans agreed to 2 conditions. First, they must be allowed to keep their weapons. Second, the colonel must promise to treat their wounds, and above all, the body of their fallen lieutenant, Maudet, with honour. Colonel Milan, who had witnessed this final, insane charge, rode up. When he heard the terms, he did not laugh. He did not mock them. He looked at the 2 survivors, at the carnage they had wrought, at the sheer, irrational bravery before him. He reportedly dismounted, walked over to the wounded legionnaires and shook their hands. "No son hombres," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Son demonios. These are not men. They are devils." He agreed to their terms. He personally ordered his own surgeons to attend to the legion's wounded. The Battle of Cameroon was over. The cost was almost total. Of the 65 legionnaires who had marched into the hacienda, nearly 40 were dead. The rest were wounded and captured. The Mexican losses, by contrast, were staggering, though they are still debated by historians. Estimates range from 300 to as many as 500 killed and wounded. Colonel Milan, in his official report, admitted to 193 casualties, a number that was likely minimized but still represented a 3-to-1 casualty ratio against the attackers. The Third Company had been annihilated, but in their destruction they had held the main Mexican army in place for 11 hours, from 7 in the morning until 6 at night. The convoy they had been sent to protect, the convoy carrying the gold and the heavy siege guns, heard the distant, continuous sound of battle. Its commander, sensing the danger, halted, fortified his position, and then advanced with extreme caution. By the time Milan's exhausted army was free to move, the convoy was safe, reinforced by a cavalry regiment sent back to find the missing patrol. The Legion had failed its tactical mission. The road was not secured, but it had succeeded in its strategic one. The convoy was saved. Some time later, perhaps the next day, a Legion burial party under Colonel Gros arrived at the scene. They found the hacienda a blackened, smoking ruin. They found the Mexican dead, left behind. They found their own comrades buried in shallow graves marked by simple wooden crosses, a sign of respect from their enemies. And, while searching the battlefield, an officer found something lying in the dust near the main gate, somehow missed by the chaos, the fire, and the looters. It was Captain Danjou's wooden hand. It was retrieved. It was carefully wrapped in cloth. It was brought back to the Legion's headquarters at Sidi Bel Abbes in Algeria. That hand, a simple piece of articulated wood, became the Legion's most sacred relic. It became more than a remnant of a brave officer. It became the physical embodiment of the oath he had inspired. It was a symbol of fidelity, loyalty not to a nation, not to a king, but to the mission itself. Today, that wooden hand rests in a glass case in the Legion's museum in Aubagne, in southern France. Once every year, on April 30th, Cameron Day, the Legion's holiest day, it is brought out. A senior NCO, chosen for his exemplary service, carries the reliquary containing the hand on a slow, solemn parade. And 10,000 legionnaires, men from over 140 different nations, stand at perfect attention. They are not celebrating a victory. They are honouring a defeat. They are commemorating a day when 65 men, given a choice between a sensible surrender and a meaningless death, chose death to honour an oath. The Battle of Cameroon, a tiny, insignificant skirmish in a forgotten colonial war, became the founding myth of the modern French Foreign Legion. It gave them their soul. It created the brand. It set the standard against which every legionnaire, for the next 160 years, would measure his own courage. The 65 men at Cameroon failed their mission. They did not secure the road. They did not by themselves save the convoy. They were annihilated. By any rational military standard, the battle was a catastrophic, pointless defeat. But the Legion is not a rational institution. It is one built on myth, on honour, and on a loyalty that borders on the religious. The men of the Third Company, that collection of German farmers, Polish exiles, and European castaways, had nothing. They had no nation. They had no honour in the outside world. They had no future. The Legion gave them the only thing they had left to value, their word. In those 11 hours, choking on dust and dying of thirst, they forged that word into an identity. They proved that the Legion's loyalty was not to a flag or a king, but to the mission and to the oath itself, even when that oath demanded an irrational, suicidal sacrifice. Today, when a new recruit joins the French Foreign Legion, he isn't just taught how to fire a rifle or march. He is taught the story of Cameron. He learns the name of d'Anjou, of Vilaine, of Mordet. He is taught, before all else, what it means to be a legionnaire, what it means to keep the faith, even when all hope is gone.